Can't sleep? Tired of counting sheep? Let the epic battles, political intrigue, and betrayals of Game of Thrones lull you into a peaceful slumber. This video condenses the entire saga into a relaxing and calming experience, perfect for drifting off to dreamland. Benefit-driven hook. Experience the thrill of Game of Thrones without the stress. This video offers a soothing and simplified summary of the complex story, perfect for those who want to enjoy the saga without the anxiety-inducing plot twists. Intriguing hook. Ever wonder what would happen if you could fall asleep while watching Game of Thrones? Now you can experience the entire saga in a calming and relaxing way, with each character's fate and every plot twist revealed in a soothing voice. In the vast continent of Westeros, where ancient castles pierce the sky like stone fingers reaching toward the stars, there lived noble houses whose fates would intertwine like threads in a great tapestry. The wind whispered through the godswoods, carrying tales of honor, ambition, and the turning of seasons that would change everything. Far in the north, where winter's breath touched the land even in summer, stood Winterfell. Its gray stones had weathered 1,000 storms, and within its walls lived the Starks, a family bound by duty and love. Eddard Stark, called Ned by those who knew him well, ruled the north with a gentle hand and an iron sense of justice. His wife Catelyn watched over their children with fierce devotion, while their young ones grew like saplings in the shadow of the great keep. There was Robb, the eldest son, whose laughter echoed through the training yards as he practiced with wooden sword. Sansa dreamed of nights and songs beside her window, embroidering while she watched the world beyond. Arya ran wild through the corridors, more interested in adventure than in proper ladylike pursuit. Little Bran climbed towers like a squirrel, seeing the world from heights that made others dizzy. Baby Rickon toddled after his siblings, and Jon Snow, Ned's bastard son, stood apart but loved, watching over them all with quiet eyes. The Starks lived by simple words. Winter is coming. Not just the season, but the understanding that hard times would always return, and one must be prepared. They honored the old gods in their heart tree, where red leaves whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Meanwhile, far to the south, where the sun painted golden light across rolling hills and vineyards, another great house pursued very different dreams. Casterly Rock rose from the western shores like a mountain of gold and ambition, home to the Lannisters. Their motto rang with different music. Hear me roar, though some whispered they might as well have said a Lannister always pays his debts. Tywin Lannister ruled his house with calculated precision, his mind sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. His children had grown in luxury but also in the shadow of his impossible expectations. Jaime, the Golden Knight, had joined the Kingsguard and won fame with his sword, though whispers followed him like shadows. Cersei had married King Robert Baratheon and worn the crown, but her heart harbored storms that no crown could calm. Tyrion, the dwarf they called the Imp, possessed perhaps the sharpest mind of all, hidden behind wine cups and bitter jests. The Lannisters understood power differently than the Starks. Where the Northerners saw duty, the Lions saw opportunity. Where honor might counsel mercy, pragmatism suggested a different path. They had gold enough to buy armies, and will enough to use them. Between these great houses, the realm balanced like a sword's edge. King Robert sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing, that great city where the smell of fish and flowers mixed with less pleasant odors, where merchants hawked their wares and nobles played their game. Robert had won his crown through war, fighting for love of a woman who had died, and now he ruled through strength that was slowly ebbing away like wine from a cracked cup. The king's court buzzed with whispers and schemes. Lords and ladies from every corner of Westeros came to seek favor, make alliances, and further their own ambitions. In shadowy corners, the master of whisperers gathered secrets like other men collected coins. The small council met to govern the realm, but their decisions rippled outward like stones thrown in still water, touching lives they would never know. And beyond the narrow sea, on the far side of the world, stirred older powers. Daenerys Targaryen, last daughter of the dynasty that once ruled Westeros, grew up in exile with her brother Viserys. They carried the blood of old Valyria, of dragon lords who had once soared across the sky on wings of fire. Though the dragons had died out, the blood remembered, and in Daenerys's dreams she sometimes heard the echo of ancient roars. The Targaryens had ruled Westeros for centuries before Robert's rebellion cast them down. Their reign had been marked by both greatness and madness. For the blood that could command dragons sometimes burned too hot in mortal veins. Now they waited in the free cities across the narrow sea, dreaming of return, while the lords of Westeros barely remembered their name. But in the farthest north, beyond even Winterfell, beyond the great wall that stretched from sea to sea, older threats stirred in the land of eternal winter. The Night's Watch, sworn brothers in black, who had taken vows to guard the realm, manned their castles along the wall and sent out rangers into the haunted forest. Most of the realm had forgotten why the wall was built, treating the Watch as a place to send criminals and unwanted sons. But some remembered the old stories, tales of the long night, when winter came for years and terrors walked that had no names. The game was always being played, though not all the players knew they held peace. Every decision, every alliance, every choice between honor and advantage moved the board toward an ending that none could foresee. Love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, wisdom and folly, all would play their parts in the great song that was beginning. The wheel of fate began to turn when King Robert decided to travel north to Winterfell. His great procession wound through the countryside like a golden snake, banners snapping in the wind, wheels creaking under the weight of royal luxury. The queen rode in her wheelhouse, beautiful and cold as winter sunlight, while the king preferred his horse in the company of his guards. Robert came seeking his old friend Ned Stark, wanting to name him Hand of the King. They had been like brothers once, fighting side by side in the rebellion that won Robert his crown. But years of ruling had changed Robert, softening his body and hardening his heart, while Ned remained constant as the North Star. When the royal party arrived at Winterfell, the entire castle turned out to greet them. The Stark children lined up in their finest clothes, trying to look properly respectful while excitement bubbled beneath their formal masks. Arya's hair wouldn't stay in place, and little Rickon hid behind his mother's skirts, overwhelmed by all the strangers. The feast that night filled Winterfell's great hall with laughter and music. Old friends shared stories and new acquaintances sized each other up like merchants examining goods for sale. But beneath the merriment, currents of tension flowed like underground stream. The queen watched everything with calculating eyes, while her twin brother Jaime charmed the ladies with golden smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Robert's offer to Ned came with the weight of friendship, but also the burden of duty. The previous hand had died under mysterious circumstances, and the realm needed someone the king could trust absolutely. Ned's honor was legendary, his loyalty unquestioned, but accepting would mean leaving the north he loved for the poisonous atmosphere of the capital. Catelyn urged him to refuse. She had visited King's Landing once, and remembered it as a place where words had three meanings and every smile might hide a dagger. But honor is a hard master, and when one's king and dearest friend asks for help, what choice does duty allow? The decision was made easier by tragedy. Young Bran, climbing as he loved to do, fell from a tower window under circumstances that seemed strange to those who knew his skill. He lay unconscious, between life and death, while his family kept vigil and prayed to whatever gods might listen. The accident, if accident it was, changed everything, as single moments sometimes do. With Bran fighting for his life, Ned felt he could not refuse the king's summon. Perhaps in King's Landing he could find answers about the previous hand's death, could serve the realm and protect his family at the same time. It was the kind of noble reasoning that wise men question but good men cannot resist. So the Lord of Winterfell accepted the king's offer, though acceptance felt like swallowing a stone. He would take his daughters south. Sansa was old enough to be presented at court, and Arya was too wild to leave behind, while Catelyn remained to tend their injured son. Robb would govern Winterfell as Ned's heir, learning the weight of command before he was truly ready. The preparations for departure took on the quality of a funeral. Everyone knew that leaving meant change, and change in the Game of Thrones rarely brought happiness to those who played it. The night before their departure, Ned visited the Godswood one last time, kneeling before the heart tree to pray for wisdom and strength. The old gods, if they listened, gave no clear answer. But in the rustling of leaves and the whisper of wind through branches, some thought they heard warnings of storms to come. In King's Landing, the great game was always in motion. The city sprawled around Aegon's Hill like a tumor of wood and stone, growing larger and more corrupt with each passing year. The Red Keep rose above it all, its walls the color of dried blood, containing within them the Iron Throne that had been forged from the swords of conquered enemies. Ned Stark arrived to find a court that operated by rules he barely understood. Where northern honor was straightforward as steel, southern politics curved and twisted like a snake eating its own tail. Lords smiled while sharpening knives. Ladies traded secrets like coins, and servants listened at every door for whispers worth selling. The small council meetings revealed how precarious the realm's situation had become. The crown was drowning in debt, borrowing gold from anyone willing to lend it. The previous hand had been asking questions about the royal finances before his death. Questions that made certain people nervous. Robert cared nothing for such details, preferring to hunt and feast and pretend that problems would solve themselves. Meanwhile, Ned's daughters struggled to adapt to their new life. Sansa bloomed in the court's attention, practicing her courtesies and dreaming of the prince she might marry. The queen's son Joffrey seemed golden and perfect, everything a young girl might wish for in a fairy tale. But Arya found court life stifling. All rules and restrictions and no room for the wild freedom she craved. The tension between the sisters came to a head during a journey to the Trident. Arya had been practicing her sword work with a butcher's boy, playing at being knights, when Prince Joffrey found them. What followed was the kind of incident that seems small at the time but echoes through history like a stone cast in still water. Joffrey, cruel as only a spoiled child can be, attacked the butcher's boy for sport. Arya defended her friend, and in the scuffle her direwolf Nymeria bit the prince. The creature's teeth drew royal blood, and suddenly a children's game became a matter of state. Queen Cersei demanded justice with the fury of a lioness protecting her cub. When Nymeria could not be found, Arya had driven her away to save her life. The queen settled for Sansa's wolf instead. Lady gentle and innocent, died for another's crime while Sansa watched in horror. The butcher's boy was hunted down and killed like an animal, guilty of nothing but being in the wrong place when princes played their games. The incident revealed the true nature of the court in ways that hours of instruction could not have taught. Justice was whatever served power's purpose. Truth mattered less than perception, and the innocent would always pay for the crimes of those too valuable to punish. Ned began to understand why his predecessor had died with so many questions unanswered. The deeper he dug into the realm's affairs, the more corruption he found. Gold flowed from the treasury into private pockets. Positions were sold to the highest bidder, and the common people suffered while their betters played elaborate games with their lives as stakes. But it was the matter of the royal succession that would prove most dangerous. Robert had children by his queen, but whispers suggested that Joffrey and his siblings bore no resemblance to their supposed father. Instead, they looked like Lannisters through and through, golden-haired and green-eyed, while Robert was dark as a storm cloud. The investigation that followed led Ned down paths he wished he had never walked. He spoke to bastards and blacksmiths, to masters of arms and servants who remembered things their betters wanted forgotten. Each piece of evidence pointed to the same terrible conclusion. The children that would inherit the Iron Throne were not the king's blood at all. The truth, when Ned finally assembled it, was both simple and devastating. The queen and her twin brother had been lovers since childhood, and their children were the fruit of that forbidden union. It explained much Cersei's cold treatment of her husband, Jaime's presence always at her side, the way the royal children looked nothing like their father. But knowing the truth and acting on it were different matters entirely. To accuse the queen of adultery and treason would tear the realm apart, yet to remain silent would be to allow a bastard to inherit the throne, breaking the line of succession that held the kingdom together. Ned chose honor over wisdom, as good men often do. He confronted Cersei privately, giving her a chance to flee with her children before he told the king the truth. It was mercy, but mercy can be its own form of foolishness when dealing with lions who fight with claws and teeth. The queen listened to his ultimatum with the calm of a cat watching a mouse, already knowing which of them would survive the encounter. She had lived her entire life in the Game of Thrones, while Ned was still learning the rule. His honor was admirable, but honor without cunning is often just another word for suicide. The wheel of fortune turned with brutal speed after that fateful conversation. King Robert, returning from a hunting trip, lay dying from wounds that might have been accidental if one believed in coincidences. His last act was to sign a document naming Ned as protector of the realm until his true heir came of age, though Ned's careful wording left the boy's identity deliberately vague. With Robert dead, the game entered its deadliest phase. Ned moved to secure the capital and place the rightful heir on the throne, but he discovered that honor was a poor substitute for gold when it came to buying loyalty. The City Watch, whom he had expected to support him, instead turned their cloaks for Lannister coin. In the throne room, with Joffrey already crowned and the court watching in tense silence, Ned made his last play for justice. He produced Robert's will and called for the rightful king to be seated. But the Lannisters had prepared for this moment, and their preparation was more thorough than his principles. Littlefinger, the master of coin, who had seemed to offer friendship, pressed a dagger to Ned's throat and whispered words that would haunt the realm. "I did warn you not to trust me." The man who dealt in debts and favors had chosen the side most likely to pay his price. Ned Stark was arrested for treason, his guards cut down, his plans shattered like glass against stone. The hand of the king became a prisoner in his own tower, while his daughters were held as hostages against his cooperation. Honor had led him into a trap from which there seemed no escape. News of these events spread across the realm like wildfire. In Winterfell, Catelyn received word that her husband was imprisoned and her daughters were in mortal danger. Robb, barely grown but suddenly bearing a lord's full burden, called the banners of the North. The great houses that had served the Starks for generations began to march, their armies gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The Riverlands, Catelyn's homeland, erupted into violence as Lannister forces ravaged the countryside in retaliation for Tyrion's capture, a separate thread in the growing tangle of war. Lord Tywin had unleashed his armies to teach the realm what happened to those who threatened his family, and the small folk paid the price in blood and tears. In King's Landing, Ned was offered a choice that was no choice at all. Confess his treason publicly, acknowledge Joffrey as the rightful king, and live out his days in black at the Wall. Refuse and watch his daughter Sansa pay the price for his stubbornness. For a father, there was only one possible answer. So the Lord of Winterfell knelt before the Iron Throne in the Sept of Baelor, surrounded by the nobility of the realm and the common folk of the city. He spoke the words they wanted to hear, confessing to crimes he had not committed, acknowledging a king he knew to be false. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but he did it for love. The crowd jeered and celebrated, pleased to see the proud northern lord brought low. But King Joffrey, cruel as his mother and twice as stupid, decided that mercy was weakness. Instead of sending Ned to the Wall as promised, he called for his execution. The great sword Ice, the Stark family blade that had served for generations, was used to take its master's head. Ned Stark died as he had lived, with dignity and courage, while his daughters watched in horror and the crowd bayed for blood. The execution changed everything. What might have been a rebellion became a war of independence. Robb Stark, proclaimed king in the north by his bannermen, led his armies south not to rescue his father but to avenge him. The realm that had known peace for 15 years suddenly found itself torn apart by the ambitions of kings and the price of honor. The death of Eddard Stark lit a fire that would consume the Seven Kingdoms for years to come. Where there had been one king, suddenly there were five, each claiming the right to rule and the power to enforce their claim. In the north, young Robb Stark wore a crown of bronze and iron, his dire wolf-gray wind at his side as he led armies that had never known defeat. The northern lords, along with the knights of the Riverlands, proclaimed him king in the north and the Trident, seeking independence from the Iron Throne that had murdered their lord. Robb proved to be a brilliant battle commander, winning victory after victory against larger, more experienced armies. He captured Jaime Lannister himself, the famous Kingslayer, though the Golden Knight's capture came at a terrible price. The war had already claimed thousands of lives, and more would follow with each passing day. In the capital, Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne with his mother as regent, styling himself the rightful king while his small council struggled to hold the realm together. But the boy's cruelty was matched only by his stupidity, and his reign was marked by arbitrary executions and senseless brutality that turned even his supporters against him. Far to the south, in the ancient seat of Storm's End, Robert's youngest brother Renly had crowned himself king as well. He had the largest army, supported by the powerful House Tyrell and their endless fields of grain. His claim was weak in law but strong in swords, and he seemed poised to march on King's Landing and take the throne by force. But Renly had not counted on his older brother Stannis, who brooded on the island fortress of Dragonstone and nursed his own claim to the crown. Stannis was Robert's heir by law, a hard man who ground his teeth at night and never smiled except when his enemies were burning. He had discovered the truth about Joffrey's parentage independently, and he would not yield his birthright to anyone. Across the narrow sea, the last Targaryens still lived, though their circumstances had changed dramatically. Viserys, the would-be king, had sold his sister Daenerys to a Dothraki warlord in exchange for an army. But the savage horsemen of the eastern grasslands proved less tractable than he had hoped, and his sister less compliant than he had planned. Daenerys, barely more than a child, found herself married to Khal Drogo and thrust into a world of violence and alien customs. But within her flowed the blood of old Valyria, and as she learned to navigate her new life, she began to discover strengths she had never known she possessed. The wedding gifts at her marriage included 3 dragon eggs, ancient and supposedly lifeless stones that had been carved and polished into objects of beauty. No dragon had been seen in the world for more than a century, but the blood of the dragon ran in Daenerys's veins, and miracles sometimes happen when the world is ready for them. War raged across Westeros like a fever, consuming lives and hope with equal hunger. The common people, who had no voice in choosing their kings, paid the highest price as armies marched back and forth across their lands, taking what they needed and destroying what they could not carry. Robb Stark continued his string of victories, but each triumph came at a cost he could barely afford. The north was vast but thinly populated, and every man who fell in battle was irreplaceable. Worse, his victories on the battlefield were not matched by success in the Game of Thrones, where alliances shifted like sand and today's friend became tomorrow's enemy. The young king's biggest mistake came disguised as love. He married for passion rather than duty, breaking his sworn oath to wed one of Lord Frey's daughters. The slight would have consequences that echoed through the years, though at the time it seemed a small thing compared to the greater war. In King's Landing, the Lannisters struggled to maintain their grip on power as enemies closed in from all sides. Tyrion, the dwarf brother, proved surprisingly capable as Hand of the King, using his wit and his family's gold to keep the realm from falling apart entirely. But even his cleverness had limits when faced with the chaos his nephew's reign had created. The city itself became a powder keg as food grew scarce and the common people began to starve. Riots erupted in the streets, and the royal family found themselves virtual prisoners in the Red Keep, protected by walls but surrounded by enemies. The Game of Thrones had always been deadly for those who played it, but now it threatened to consume everyone in the kingdom. Meanwhile, the war between the brothers Baratheon reached its climax on the shores of Storm's End. Stannis had acquired a new advisor, a red priestess from Eshai who worshipped a god of fire and shadow. Her magic was real, though its price was measured in souls and sanity. The shadow that killed Renly came from his brother's flesh but bore a woman's guidance. And with the younger brother's death, his great army melted away like morning mist. Some men went home, others joined Stannis, and a few chose their own paths in the chaos that followed. The War of 5 Kings had become a war of 4, though the killing continued without pause. On Dragonstone, Stannis prepared for his assault on King's Landing, gathering ships and men for what would be the greatest battle the capital had ever seen. He had right on his side and the largest fleet in Westeros, but his enemies had wildfire and desperation, and both could be more dangerous than steel. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys faced her own trials as her husband's Khalasar dissolved after his death. The Dothraki followed strength, and a widow with no warriors commanded no respect among the horse lords. But she had something they did not: 3 dragon eggs, and the will to work miracles. The pyre that consumed Khal Drogo also consumed the last of the Targaryens' exile. When the flames died down and the ashes cooled, Daenerys emerged unburnt and unbroken, with 3 living dragons wrapped around her like jewelry. The Age of Dragons had returned to the world, though few yet understood what that would mean. The great battle that would decide the fate of King's Landing began on the dark waters of Blackwater Bay, where Stannis Baratheon's fleet approached the capital like a forest of masts and sails. The usurper's brother had come to claim his birthright, and his ships filled the horizon from shore to shore. In the Red Keep, the defenders prepared for what many believed would be their last stand. Tyrion had spent weeks preparing the city's defenses, using every trick and stratagem his clever mind could devise. But cleverness could only do so much against overwhelming numbers and righteous fury. The battle began with fire and ended with fire, though not the kind anyone expected. Tyrion's wildfire, that green substance that burned on water and consumed everything it touched, turned the bay into a cauldron of death. Ships that had sailed proudly into battle became floating crematoriums, their crews screaming as they burned alive. But Stannis was not easily deterred, and his remaining forces pressed their attack with the grim determination that had always marked his character. The walls of King's Landing shook under the assault, and for a moment it seemed that the city would fall and the Lannisters would pay for all their crimes. The tide turned when Lord Tywin arrived with a new army, the banners of House Tyrell flying alongside his own. The alliance had been bought with promises and sealed with blood, and its arrival on the battlefield changed everything in an instant. Stannis's forces, caught between the city's defenders and this fresh army, were crushed like grain between millstones. The battle's aftermath left thousands dead, and the realm's future unclear. Stannis had escaped to fight another day, but his power was broken and his fleet destroyed. Joffrey remained on the Iron Throne, but his hold on it was more tenuous than ever, dependent on alliances that could shift with the next change of wind. For Tyrion, the battle was both triumph and tragedy. He had saved the city and proven his worth, but a blow to the head during the fighting left him scarred and changed. The ugly little dwarf, who had always relied on his wits, found himself struggling to remember words and thoughts that had once come easily. In the north, the war ground on like a millstone, crushing lives and hopes with relentless precision. Robb Stark's military victories could not overcome the political mistakes that slowly strangled his cause. His marriage for love had cost him the Freys. His mother's release of Jaime Lannister had cost him his most valuable hostage, and his execution of Lord Karstark had cost him crucial northern support. The young king in the north found himself trapped by his own honor, unable to make the compromises that might have saved his cause. Like his father before him, he chose duty and principle over pragmatism, and like his father, he would pay the ultimate price for that choice. The trap that destroyed him was baited with reconciliation and sealed with guest right. the sacred law that protected those who shared bread and salt under another's roof. Lord Walder Frey, ancient and bitter, invited the young king to his wedding, offering to heal the breach between their houses with celebration and forgiveness. But the Freys had not forgiven, and the Lannisters had not forgotten. In the great hall of the twins, as musicians played and wine flowed, the trap was sprung with ruthless efficiency. The song they played was the Rains of Castamere, the ballad of another proud house that had defied the lions of Casterly Rock and paid the price in blood. The slaughter that followed was swift and merciless. Robb Stark died with his wife and his unborn child, while his mother watched in horror before joining them in death. The Northern Army, leaderless and surrounded, was butchered like sheep, their dreams of independence drowning in their own blood. Grey Wind, the king's dire wolf, was killed in his cage, unable to save his master as he had in so many battles before. In a final insult, the Freys sewed the wolf's head onto Robb's body, mocking the Stark words and the loyalty that had brought them nothing but death. The Red Wedding, as it came to be known, ended the War of Five Kings in all but name. The North was broken, its leaders dead or scattered, its armies destroyed. The Lannisters had won through treachery what they could not achieve through honest battle, and their victory tasted of ashes and blood. In King's Landing, the Lannisters celebrated their triumph with a royal wedding that was meant to secure their dynasty for generations to come. Joffrey was to marry Margaery Tyrell, the beautiful daughter of the house that had helped save the capital, cementing the alliance that had won them the war. The wedding feast was a display of wealth and power that dazzled even the jaded nobles of the capital. Gold and silver gleamed on every table. The finest foods were served in abundance, and entertainers from across the known world performed for the pleasure of the assembled guests. But beneath the pageantry, the same poisonous currents that had always flowed through the Red Keep continued their work. Joffrey had grown more cruel and unstable with each passing month, his sadistic impulses unchecked by wisdom or restraint. Even his own family began to see him as a liability that might destroy everything they had worked to build. The king's death came as suddenly as summer lightning, his wine cup falling from nerveless fingers as poison worked its way through his system. He died as he had lived, surrounded by enemies disguised as friends, his last moments a parody of the power he had wielded so carelessly. The chaos that followed his death was immediate and total. Accusations flew like arrows, suspects were seized and tortured, and the realm that had seemed so stable suddenly teetered on the edge of another war. Tyrion, found with the wine cup in his hands, became the chief suspect in his nephew's murder. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice, though not in the way most expected. The evidence against Tyrion was circumstantial at best, but his guilt or innocence mattered less than the political necessity of finding someone to blame. His own father was willing to sacrifice him to maintain the family's hold on power. In the end, Tyrion demanded trial by combat, as was his right under the old laws. But his champion fell to the mountain, Gregor Clegane, the monstrous knight who served as the Lannisters' most feared enforcer. Justice, like so many other noble concepts, proved powerless against brute strength and political expediency. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen had begun her own conquest, though her enemies were not kings but masters, and her goal was not a throne but freedom itself. The young queen had discovered that her dragons were not merely weapons but symbols of a new kind of power, one that could break chains that had bound humanity for centuries. In Slaver's Bay, she moved from city to city like a force of nature, her growing army of freedmen following her with the devotion of the truly converted. Astapor fell first, its masters burned alive by dragonfire while their unsullied warriors chose freedom over bondage. Yunkai yielded without a siege, its wise masters preferring negotiation to incineration. But it was Meereen, greatest of the slaver cities, that proved the true test of her resolve. The city's masters crucified slave children to mock her approach, lining the road with their small broken bodies, as a warning of what defiance would cost. The sight kindled a rage in Daenerys that burned hotter than dragonfire itself. The siege of Meereen showcased both the power of dragons and their limitations. The great beasts could burn ships and walls, but they could not govern cities or heal the wounds that slavery had carved into human soul. Victory in battle was easier than victory in peace, as Daenerys would learn to her cost. When the city fell, she faced the same choice that had confronted conquerors throughout history: rule through fear or attempt to build something better. She chose the harder path, trying to transform a society built on oppression into something approaching justice. The results were mixed at best, and the cost in blood and treasure was higher than she had imagined. Her dragons, growing larger and more dangerous with each passing day, became both her greatest asset and her greatest liability. The people she had freed began to fear the creatures that had liberated them, while the former masters plotted to use that fear against her. Power, she discovered, was far easier to seize than to wield wisely. At the end of the world, where the wall rose like a frozen cliff face toward the sky, the Night's Watch continued their ancient vigil in crumbling castles manned by too few men. The great barrier of ice and magic had stood for thousands of years, but time and neglect had weakened both its stones and its purpose. Jon Snow, bastard son of Ned Stark, had taken the Black and found a new family among the sworn brothers of the Watch. But the organization he had joined was a shadow of its former glory, reduced to housing criminals and outcasts rather than the noble knights of legend. Beyond the Wall, in the lands of eternal winter, older threats than any king or queen were stirring. The wildlings, the free folk who had lived north of the barrier since its construction, were fleeing south in numbers not seen for generations. They spoke of white walkers and dead things walking, of an ancient enemy that had returned to claim the world of the living. Most dismissed their stories as superstition and savagery, but some remembered the old tales. The wall had not been built to keep out mere human raiders, but something far worse, something that had nearly destroyed the world once before. If the stories were true, the Game of Thrones was about to become irrelevant in the face of a greater threat. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had united the squabbling wildling clans into a single great host, not for conquest but for survival. His people were fleeing something that made death itself seem preferable to staying and fighting. Their desperate march south would bring them into conflict with the Watch, but their true enemy lay in the frozen wastes behind them. The brothers of the Night's Watch, sworn to defend the realm against all threats from the north, found themselves caught between duty and pragmatism. Their vows demanded they stop the wildling invasion, but their limited numbers made victory impossible. Worse, some among them had begun to believe the stories of what lay beyond the reach of mortal sight. As the great game neared its end, the realm found itself forever changed by the ambitions of those who had sought to rule it. The Iron Throne, forged from 1,000 conquered swords, had claimed more lives than any war, and its jagged edges had cut all who tried to claim it. In the north, winter finally came in earnest, bringing with it truths that made the struggles of kings seem small as children's games. The Wall, ancient guardian of the realm, fell to forces that cared nothing for crowns or gold. The living and the dead would meet in final battle, and the outcome would determine whether spring would ever come again. Across the narrow sea, dragons soared toward home at last, carrying with them the hopes and fears of a girl who had become a conqueror. The Targaryen words, fire and blood, would be tested against ice and death in the ruins of the world that had forgotten its true enemy. The Game of Thrones was ending as it had begun, with fire and ice, with honor and betrayal, with the eternal struggle between those who would build and those who would destroy. In the end, the Iron Throne itself would prove to be just another chair, while the real victory lay in choosing love over power, hope over fear, and tomorrow over yesterday. And so the great song concluded, not with the triumph of any single player, but with the understanding that the game itself had always been the true enemy. The wheel that had crushed so many beneath its weight was finally broken, and perhaps in time, something better could grow from the ashes of what had been. In distant lands and quiet halls, survivors would tell these tales to their children, teaching them that power without wisdom is tyranny, that honor without pragmatism is folly, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would trade it for the illusion of safety. The realm would endure, as it always had, carrying forward the lessons learned in blood and written in memory. And somewhere in the north, where the old gods still listened to those who knew how to hear them, the wind through the godswood whispered that winter was coming again, as it always did, as it always would. But for now, there was peace, and that was enough. In the aftermath of King Robert's death and Lord Stark's execution, the Seven Kingdoms found themselves torn apart like a tapestry pulled in too many directions. Where once there had been one king ruling from the Iron Throne, now 5 men wore crowns and called themselves the rightful ruler of Westeros. The realm bled from 1,000 wounds as armies marched back and forth across the land, each carrying banners that proclaimed their lord's claim to ultimate power. The war had begun with the sound of steel on steel, but it would be remembered for the silence that followed, the quiet of empty villages, the stillness of fields left untended, the hush that falls over battlefields when the last sword has fallen. It was a time when the Game of Thrones revealed its true nature, showing that the price of power was always paid in blood, and the currency was the lives of those who had never asked to play. In King's Landing, the Red Keep rose like a blood-colored mountain above the sprawling city, its walls containing the boy King Joffrey and his mother Cersei. The golden-haired Queen Regent ruled in her son's name, but her grip on power was as fragile as morning frost. The city itself had become a cauldron of tension, where hungry crowds gathered in the streets and whispered of the kings who promised them bread and peace. Young Joffrey sat the Iron Throne with all the confidence of youth and none of the wisdom of experience. The twisted seat of swords bit into those who sat upon it, as if the metal remembered the blood that had forged it. The boy king's cruelty was legendary even among those who served him, and his small council struggled to contain the damage his whims might cause to their cause. Far to the north, beyond the great wall that stretched from sea to sea, older forces stirred in the land of eternal winter. The ancient enemy that had once brought the long night was waking from its slumber of centuries, and the dead were walking in the haunted forest. But the realm of the living was too busy fighting itself to notice the shadows gathering at the edge of the world. Robb Stark had been barely more than a boy when his father rode south to serve as Hand of the King. Now, with winter coming and war raging, he had grown into a young man whose gray eyes held the weight of command. The northern lords had proclaimed him king in the north, placing a crown of bronze and iron upon his auburn head, while his direwolf Grey Wind watched from beside his chair. The great hall of Winterfell, where the Starks had ruled for thousands of years, echoed with the sound of war councils and the planning of campaigns. Maps covered every table, marked with the movements of armies and the locations of battles yet to be fought. The young king studied them by candlelight, learning the hard lessons of leadership while his mother Catelyn offered counsel born of love and worry. Robb's army was a thing of northern pride, men who had never known defeat, who fought with the fury of winter wolves and the endurance of the ancient stones of their homeland. They followed their young king not just out of duty, but out of love, for he was Ned Stark's son, and the Stark name still meant something in a world where honor had become as rare as dragon's gold. The Riverlands, his mother's ancestral home, had declared for him as well. Lord Hoster Tully, though old and failing, had opened his castle gates to the northern army. The trout banners of the Tullys flew alongside the grey direwolf of House Stark, and the combined forces of the north and the Riverlands made Robb's the largest of the rebel army. But size alone would not win the war. The young king faced enemies on all sides. The Lannisters to the south with their gold and their cunning, the Ironborn to the west with their longships and their ancient hunger for conquest, and the divided loyalties of lords who changed sides as easily as they changed their cloak. Every victory came at a price, and every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives. Grey Wind padded silently through the halls of captured castles, his yellow eyes reflecting the torchlight as he followed his master. The direwolf had grown large as a small horse, and men whispered that he could smell lies on the wind. In battle he was a terror to behold, his howl striking fear into the hearts of enemies who had never seen such a creature outside of legend. On the island fortress of Dragonstone, where black stone rose from the sea like the bones of ancient monsters, Stannis Baratheon brooded over his claim to the Iron Throne. The middle brother of the Baratheon line, He had always been the most dutiful, the most lawful, the most uncompromising in his sense of justice. Now, with Robert dead and Joffrey revealed as a bastard born of incest, the crown was his by right. Stannis was a hard man made harder by years of thankless service. His jaw was set like granite, his eyes as gray as winter seas, and his heart as unyielding as the stone walls of his ancestral seat. He had served his brothers faithfully, holding Storm's End against impossible odds during Robert's rebellion, governing Dragonstone with iron discipline, building a fleet that was the envy of the Seven Kingdoms. Beside him stood a woman who had come from the far east, from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai, where sorcery was as common as sunrise. Melisandre of Ashai wore robes as red as blood and rubies that seemed to burn with inner fire. She preached of a god called R'hllor, the Lord of Light, who she claimed had chosen Stannis as his champion in the great war between light and darkness that was coming to the world. The Red Priestess spoke of prophecies and visions in the flames, of a prince who was promised who would draw a burning sword from fire and lead the forces of light against the darkness. Her magic was real. She had proven that much with shadows and fire, but the price of her aid was measured in more than gold or loyalty. She demanded faith, absolute and unquestioning, in her god and her vision. Stannis's fleet was the largest in Westeros, a forest of masts and sails that could carry his army anywhere the tide could reach. His soldiers were disciplined and well-trained, hardened by years of service and bound by oaths stronger than iron. But his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness: his absolute refusal to bend or compromise, his determination to have justice, though the heavens fall. To the south, his younger brother Renly had also claimed the crown, though his claim was weaker in law and stronger in love. Where Stannis was duty, Renly was charm. Where Stannis was iron, Renly was gold. The younger brother had married Margaery Tyrell, binding the power of Highgarden to his cause, and his army was the largest of all the claimants. The Reach had joined Renly's cause, not just for his pretty face and easy laughter, but for the promise of a different kind of rule. The Tyrells were proud and ambitious, but they were also pragmatic. They had provided food for King's Landing for generations, and they understood that a kingdom could not survive on swords alone. It needed grain and gold, trade and treaties, the kind of patient work that built lasting peace. Renly's court was a festival of chivalry and courtly love, where knights wore flowers in their helms and ladies sang of brave deeds and noble hearts. Tournaments were held even as war raged, and the sound of laughter rang out from silk pavilions while other armies prepared for battle. It was a beautiful dream, but dreams have a way of shattering when they meet the harsh edge of reality. On the Iron Islands, where the sea crashed against black cliffs and the salt spray tasted of ancient victories, Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king once more. The Ironborn had been conquered once before, their rebellion crushed by Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark. But the old ways died hard among the children of the sea. The Greyjoys had ruled the islands for 1,000 years, and their words spoke of their nature. We do not. They were reavers and raiders, men who took what they needed from the sea and from their enemies. Their god was the drowned god, who had made them to reave and rape and carve out kingdoms with fire and sword. Balon was old now, his hair white as sea foam and his face carved with lines of bitterness and defeat. He had seen his sons die in his first rebellion, had been forced to send his last surviving boy to Winterfell as a hostage. But Theon had returned to him, grown tall and proud in the halls of his enemies, and the Ironborn king saw in his son's return a sign that the time had come to strike again. The Iron Fleet was ancient and terrible, longships with iron-reinforced hulls that could beach on any shore and carry warriors into the heart of their enemies' lands. The Ironborn were born to the sea, as comfortable on a rolling deck as other men were on solid ground. They knew every current and tide, every reef and harbor, every place where a ship might land and an army might march inland. But the Ironborn were few, and their enemies were many. The old ways that had made them strong, the raiding and the reaving, the refusal to farm or trade, had also made them weak. They could strike like lightning, but they could not hold what they conquered. Their strength was in their ships and their fury, but fury alone could not win a war against the combined might of the mainland kingdoms. Theon Greyjoy had grown up as Ned Stark's ward, treated more like a son than a hostage, but blood called to blood, and the sea sang in his veins. He had returned to the Iron Islands to find a people who remembered him as a boy but expected him to be a man. The choice between the family that had raised him and the family that had birthed him would tear at his heart like a fishhook, and the decision he made would echo through the years like the crash of waves on stone. Across the narrow sea, in the red waste that stretched beyond the edge of all maps, Daenerys Targaryen struggled to keep her small band of followers alive. The great grass sea of the Dothraki had become a hostile wilderness after her husband's death, and the Khaleesi, who had once commanded a khalasar of 40,000, now led fewer than 100 souls. Her dragons, the first to be born in more than a century, were still small enough to perch on her shoulders, but they grew stronger with each passing day. Drogon, black as midnight with scarlet eyes, was the largest and most aggressive. Viserion, cream and gold like the brother she had lost, was gentle but proud. Rhaegal, green and bronze like the dragon of the first Aegon, was fierce and loyal. They were her children, born from fire and blood, and in them lived the power of old Valyria. The small band of survivors included Ser Jorah Mormont, the exiled northern knight who had found redemption in service to the last Targaryen. His love for his queen was as obvious as sunrise, though he knew it could never be returned. He had betrayed her once, spying for the spider in King's Landing, but his loyalty now was absolute, bought with shame and sealed with devotion. Among her people were the remnants of her husband's khalasar, warriors who had chosen to follow her rather than seek other khalasars, women and children who had nowhere else to go, slaves who had been freed by dragonfire and chose to remain. They looked to her for guidance and protection, and she felt the weight of their trust like a crown of iron. The red waste tested them all, its sun like a hammer and its nights like a blade of ice. Water was precious as rubies, food scarcer than gold. The dragons needed meat, and there was little to be found in the endless expanse of sand and stone. But Daenerys had learned that a queen must be strong for her people, even when she felt weakest, especially when she felt weakest. In her dreams she saw visions of the Iron Throne, the seat her ancestors had carved from conquest and held for 3 centuries. She saw King's Landing burning, the Red Keep crumbling, the dragons of her house soaring above the 7 kingdoms once more. But dreams were not prophecies, and the path to reclaiming her birthright would be paved with more than good intentions and noble blood. The ancient city of Qarth lay ahead, its walls rising from the desert like a mirage made real. The Queen of Cities, they called it, where merchants from every corner of the world came to trade in spices and silk, slaves and sorcery. It would be her first real test as a queen, her first chance to prove that she was more than just a girl with dragons, that she was the blood of the dragon, the last heir of Aegon the Conqueror. The greatest battle of the War of 5 Kings came to the waters of Blackwater Bay like a storm made of steel and fire. Stannis Baratheon's fleet filled the horizon, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of men, their sails marked with the flaming heart of Rath. The attack on King's Landing would be the decisive moment that determined whether the Lannisters kept their hold on the Iron Throne or lost everything to the rightful king. In the Red Keep, Tyrion Lannister had spent weeks preparing the city's defenses, using every trick and stratagem his clever mind could devise. The Imp, as they called him, had been named Hand of the King in his father's absence, and he was determined to prove that wit could triumph over might. His secret weapon lay hidden beneath the waters of the bay, wildfire, the alchemist's green substance that burned on water and consumed everything it touched. The battle began at dawn, with the sound of horns echoing across the water and the creak of oars cutting through the morning mist. Stannis' ships advanced in perfect formation, their discipline evident in every movement. But as they entered the bay, Tyrion's trap was sprung, and the water itself became their enemy. The explosion that followed could be seen from miles away, a green sun rising from the depths of the bay. Ships that had sailed proudly into battle became floating crematoriums, their crews screaming as they burned alive. The wildfire spread across the water like a living thing, consuming everything in its path, turning the bay into a cauldron of death. But Stannis was not easily deterred. His remaining ships pressed forward, and his men fought with the grim determination that had always marked their king's character. They reached the shore and stormed the walls of King's Landing, their ladders rising like a forest of steel against the ancient stone. For a moment it seemed that the city would fall and the Lannisters would pay for all their crimes. The tide turned with the sound of horns from the west, as Lord Tywin arrived with a new army. The banners of House Tyrell flew alongside his own, roses and lions united in common cause. The alliance had been bought with promises and sealed with blood, and its arrival on the battlefield changed everything in an instant. Stannis's forces, caught between the city's defenders and this fresh army, were crushed like grain between millstones. The rightful king escaped with a handful of ships and a corps of loyal men, but his power was broken and his fleet destroyed. The Battle of Blackwater had decided the fate of King's Landing, but it had not ended the war. It had only made it longer and bloodier. In the aftermath of the Great Battle, the realm settled into an uneasy pattern of raid and reprisal, siege and sortie. The War of Five Kings had become a war of attrition, where victory would go not to the bravest or the most noble, but to whoever could endure the longest and pay the highest price in blood and gold. Robb Stark continued his campaign in the Riverlands, winning battle after battle, but finding that military victory did not translate to political success. Each triumph came at a cost he could barely afford, and the young king began to understand that wars were easier to start than to finish. His marriage to Jane Westerling, a girl he had met while recovering from a wound, would prove to be a decision that echoed through the years with consequences he could never have foreseen. The Ironborn had struck like lightning at the western coasts, their long ships appearing without warning to raid and burn before vanishing back into the grey waters. Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell itself, the ancient seat of House Stark, in a bold stroke that shocked the realm. But holding a castle was different from taking it, and the young heir to the Iron Islands would learn that some victories are more costly than defeats. At the Wall, the Night's Watch prepared for their own war as reports came in of wildlings massing beyond the barrier. The Free Folk, as they called themselves, were fleeing south in numbers not seen for generations. They spoke of white shadows and dead things walking, of an ancient enemy that had returned to claim the world of the living. Most dismissed their stories as superstition, but some remembered the old tales and prepared for winter in more ways than one. Jon Snow, bastard son of Ned Stark, found himself beyond the Wall with a ranging party, searching for Benjen Stark and learning truths that would shake his understanding of the world. Among the wildlings he met Ygritte, a girl with fire in her hair and laughter in her voice, who would teach him that the world was more complex than the vows he had sworn suggested. The red comet that had appeared in the sky after the dragons were born continued its journey across the heavens, visible to all but interpreted differently by each observer. Some called it the Red Sword, others the King's Comet, still others the Dragon's Tail. In the end, it was what all such omens were, a mirror in which people saw their own hopes and fears reflected back at them. Winter was coming to Westeros in more ways than one, and the realm that had known 15 years of peace found itself unprepared for the harsh realities of war. The great game that had seemed so glorious in songs and stories revealed its true nature as a grinding mill that consumed lives and honor with equal appetite. In the Godswood of Winterfell, where the Heart Tree had watched over the Starks for thousands of years, the red leaves whispered secrets that only the wind could understand. The old gods, if they still listened, kept their counsel, but the northern lords who had served House Stark for generations prepared for a reckoning that would test every oath and every bond of loyalty. Bran Stark, the boy who had fallen from a tower and lived, discovered that his injury had opened doors in his mind that few mortals ever passed through. In his dreams he flew with ravens and saw through the eyes of wolves, touching a power that was older than the Wall and deeper than the roots of the Heart Tree. The three-eyed crow called to him from beyond the reach of mortal sight, promising answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. His sister Arya, lost in the chaos of war, wandered the Riverlands with a list of names that grew longer with each cruelty she witnessed. The The girl who had once played at swords with the butcher's boy was learning that the world was a harder place than the songs suggested, and that justice was often a luxury that only the strong could afford. Sansa, trapped in King's Landing like a bird in a cage, discovered that the courtesy and grace her mother had taught her could be armor as strong as steel. In the court of the boy King Joffrey, where cruelty was entertainment and mercy was weakness, she learned to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of perfect politeness. The pack was scattered, but the blood of the wolf ran strong in each of them. Winter was coming, and when it arrived, the North would remember what it meant to be stark. At the edge of the world, where the wall rose like a frozen cliff toward the sky, the Night's Watch continued their ancient vigil in castles that seemed to grow smaller and colder with each passing year. The great barrier of ice and magic had stood for thousands of years, but time and neglect had weakened both its stones and its purpose. The rangers who ventured beyond the wall brought back tales that chilled the blood of even the bravest men. Villages found empty with no sign of battle or struggle, as if their inhabitants had simply vanished into the wind. Wildling camps abandoned in haste, their fires still burning but their owners nowhere to be found. And in the deepest woods, where even the free folk feared to tread, shapes that moved in the darkness and left no tracks in the snow. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had united the squabbling wildling clans into a single great host for the first time in living memory. The former crow who had abandoned his black cloak for the freedom of the wild had become a leader of men through strength and cunning. But even he could not stand against the ancient terror that was driving his people south. The free folk were not fleeing toward the wall. They were fleeing from something far worse. Their desperate march would bring them into conflict with the Night's Watch. But their true enemy lay in the frozen wastes behind them, in the land of always winter where the dead did not rest and the night never ended. In the crypts of Winterfell, the stone kings of the north slept their eternal sleep. But their dreams were troubled by visions of ice and shadow. The words of House Stark echoed through the darkness. Winter is coming. But this winter would be different from all the others, for it would bring with it the memory of the long night, when the dead walked and the living hid behind walls of ice and fear. As the war ground on, the realm learned the true cost of the Game of Thrones. The small folk, who had no voice in choosing their kings, paid the highest price as armies marched back and forth across their lands, taking what they needed and burning what they could not carry. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and the roads became hunting grounds for bandits and broken men. The 5 kings who had begun the war found their crowns growing heavier with each passing day. Power, they discovered, was not a possession to be won but a burden to be carried, and the weight of it broke some men while forging others into something harder than steel. In the God's Wood and the Sept, in the halls of learning and the chambers of power, wise men spoke of the wheel that raised up some and cast down others, never ceasing in its turning. The Game of Thrones was eternal, they said, and only the players changed while the rules remained the same. But beyond the concerns of kings and queens, beyond the reach of armies and the grasp of ambition, older powers stirred in the darkness. The real war was not between the living but between the living and the dead, between the light and the shadow, between the world that was and the world that would be if winter truly came. The realm would endure, as it always had, but the price of survival would be measured in more than gold or blood. It would be paid in the choices made by those who had the courage to choose love over power, hope over fear, and tomorrow over yesterday. And in the end, when the last battle was fought and the last crown was cast down, the survivors would remember that the true victory was not in ruling, but in protecting, not in conquering but in preserving, not in the throne of swords but in the simple truth that some things were worth more than power itself. The wheel would turn, as it always did, but perhaps, just perhaps, it might be broken at last. In the far north of a land called Westeros, where ancient magic still whispered through the pines and snow fell like gentle dreams, there stood a great wall of ice. For thousands of years, this wall had protected the realm of men from the darkness that lay beyond. But now, as our story begins, That wall was beginning to crack and crumble, like an old man's resolve in his final winter. The wind carried more than snow these days. It carried whispers of an ancient enemy stirring in the frozen wastes. The White Walkers, beings of ice and death, who had slumbered for generations beyond counting. Their eyes glowed like winter stars, and where they walked, life itself grew still and cold. But let us not dwell on darkness, for even in the deepest winter there are those who carry light. In the great castle of Winterfell, where the Stark family had ruled for thousands of years, a young woman named Sansa stood at her window, watching the snow fall. She had seen much sorrow in her life, the loss of family, the cruelty of those who sought power above all else. But she had learned that even the gentlest snow, given time, could cover the harshest scar. "The reports from the wall grow worse each day," said her brother Jon, entering the chamber with the quiet step of one who had learned to move through dangerous places. He had been chosen to lead the Night's Watch, those brave men who guarded the wall, though the burden sat heavy on his young shoulders. Sansa turned from the window, her red hair catching the firelight like autumn leaves. "Then we must prepare, all of us, together." Meanwhile, far to the south in the great city King's Landing, where the Iron Throne sat like a chair made of sharp memories, other minds were turning to the same dark thoughts. Tyrion Lannister, the clever little lord who often said the wisest things in the most difficult moments, stood in the throne room studying ancient books by candlelight. "The histories speak of this enemy," he murmured to himself, turning pages yellow with age. "They came before in the long night, when heroes of old stood together against the darkness. Perhaps they can teach us still." His sister Cersei, golden-haired and fierce as a lioness protecting her cubs, paced near. She had fought her own battles for power and survival, making choices both wise and foolish in equal measure. But now, faced with a threat that cared nothing for crowns or gold, even she began to understand that some fights required more than cunning. "You speak of heroes," she said, her voice softer than usual, "but I see only frightened lords and broken houses. How can we stand against the dead when we can barely stand with each other?" That very morning, ravens had flown to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, black birds carrying scrolls, sealed with wax, each bearing the same urgent message. The Night King, leader of the White Walkers, had been seen marching south with an army that grew larger with every mile. The dead walked beside him, and where his cold gaze fell, even the bravest hearts grew still. In the Vale, where mountains touched the sky like sleeping giants, Lord Robin Arryn read the message with trembling hand. In Dorne, where the sun beat down on red rocks and desert flowers, Prince Oberyn's daughters sharpened their spears. On the Iron Islands, where the sea crashed against cliffs that had weathered 1,000 storms, the Ironborn prepared their But perhaps the most important raven of all flew to Dragonstone, the ancient island fortress, where dragons had once been born. There, a young queen named Daenerys stood on the battlements, her silver hair streaming in the salt wind. Behind her, 3 dragons, creatures of fire and magic that men had thought lost forever, spread their wings against the sunset. "The time has come," she whispered to her dragons, and they rumbled in response, understanding in the way that only the most magical creatures can. "Fire and ice have always been enemies, but perhaps together we can bring balance." 7 days later, in the great hall of Winterfell, something happened that few had thought possible. Lords and ladies who had spent years fighting each other now sat at the same table, their banners hanging side by side like old friends reunited. Sansa Stark sat at the head of the table, her voice calm and clear as she spoke. "We have all lost much in our quarrels with one another. Family, friends, the very trust that should bind us together. But now we face something that threatens not just our houses but all life itself." Jon Snow, who had been beyond the wall and seen the enemy with his own eyes, stood to speak. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of truth. I have seen them. They do not tire, they do not fear, they do not stop. But they can be fought. Fire stops them. Dragonglass breaks them, and most importantly, unity defeats them. Daenerys nodded, her dragons visible through the great windows, their forms dark against the twilight sky. I came to Westeros seeking a throne, but thrones are built by the living, for the living. What good is ruling over a kingdom of ice and death? Even the proud Lannisters found themselves nodding in agreement. Jaime, the golden-handed knight who had made mistakes but learned from them, spoke with unexpected humility. I have served kings and queens, fought battles for causes both noble and selfish, but I have never fought for something as simple and important as tomorrow. Old Samuel Tarly, round-faced and gentle-hearted, had brought books, so many books that they filled 3 carts. He adjusted his spectacles and spoke in the careful way of one who had spent long hours reading by candlelight. The histories tell us how they were defeated before. It required 3 things: the courage of warriors, the wisdom of maesters, and the cooperation of those who had never cooperated before. As the days passed, old enemies worked side by side like neighbors sharing a common task. In the forges of Winterfell, smiths worked day and night, shaping dragonglass into weapons that could cut through the magic that bound the dead. The sound of hammers rang out like a heartbeat, steady and determined. Arya Stark, youngest daughter of Winterfell, who had learned the skills of shadow and silence, taught others how to move unseen and strike where the enemy least expected. Her needle-thin sword caught the light as she demonstrated techniques learned in distant lands. The dead may not feel fear, she said with a small smile, but they still have weak points, and they still fall when those points are found. Bran Stark, who had become something more than just a boy through strange and magical means, sat quietly in his chair, his eyes seeing far beyond the walls of the castle. Sometimes he would speak in a voice older than his years, sharing visions of where the enemy moved and what they planned. They seek the living, he would say, his voice carrying the whisper of ancient knowledge. But they fear the fire that burns not just in hearth and forge, but in the hearts of those who fight for each other. The dragons proved invaluable not just as weapons but as symbols of hope. When Drogon spread his great wings and breathed flame that turned night into day, even the most frightened soldier felt courage kindle in their chest. The sight of such magnificent creatures fighting alongside them reminded everyone that magic still existed in the world. Good magic, protective magic, magic that served life rather than death. When the attack finally came, it came like winter itself, slowly at first, then all at once. The White Walkers moved in silence across the snow-covered lands, their army of the dead stretching beyond the horizon like a dark sea. But the living were ready. From the walls of Winterfell, signals flashed to other castles, and those castles sent signals to others, until a chain of light stretched across the north like a constellation fallen to earth. Armies that had once fought each other now stood shoulder to shoulder, their weapons gleaming with dragonglass and their hearts burning with purpose. The battle itself was like a deadly dance performed on a stage of snow and starlight. The dragons wheeled overhead, their fire cutting through the darkness like falling stars. On the ground, warriors fought with the desperation of those who knew that failure meant not defeat, but the end of all things, warm and living. Sansa stood on the battlements, not with sword in hand, but with the harder task of keeping hope alive in those who could not fight. Her voice carried across the courtyard steady and strong, reminding everyone what they fought for, not glory or gold, but the right to see another spring. Jon led from the front as he always had, his sword singing through the cold air. Beside him fought men and women from every corner of the 7 kingdoms, their differences forgotten in the face of their common need. But it was perhaps Tyrion who fought the most important battle of all, not with sword or spear, but with his mind. He had studied the ancient texts and found patterns in the enemy's movements, weaknesses in their seemingly perfect order. His voice rang out across the battlefield, directing the living to strike where the dead were most vulnerable. The battle raged through the longest night anyone could remember. And when dawn finally came, it came red and gold like dragonfire. The White Walkers had been turned back, their leader fallen, their armies scattered like shadows before the morning light. But victory always comes with a price. Many brave souls had given their lives so that others might live to see the sun rise. In the great hall of Winterfell, places at the table sat empty, and names were spoken with reverence and sorrow. Yet even in grief, there was hope. The wall, strengthened by both magic and the hard work of many hands, stood strong again. The dragons had survived, and their presence promised that the ancient threats need never return. Most importantly, the great houses of Westeros had learned that they were stronger together than apart. In the weeks that followed, as spring began its gentle return to the north, the realm began to heal. Lords and ladies who had schemed against each other now worked together to rebuild what had been damaged. Trade routes reopened, marriages were celebrated, and children played in courtyards that had once echoed with the sound of preparation for war. Sansa found herself not just Lady of Winterfell, but something like a Queen of the North, though she wore no crown and sat on no iron throne. Her rule was gentler than that, based on trust earned rather than fear imposed. In the evenings she would sit by her fire and read letters from across the realm, each one telling of some small improvement, some reason for hope. Jon, no longer bound to the Night's Watch now that its purpose had been fulfilled, traveled often between the great houses, carrying messages and maintaining the bonds that had been forged in darkness and proved in fire. He had learned that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in ruling, but in serving the connections between others. Daenerys returned to the warmer lands of the south, but not as a conqueror. Her dragons were no longer weapons of war, but guardians of peace, their presence a reminder that the realm had protectors watching over it. She found that ruling through love was more satisfying than ruling through fear, and her people prospered under her gentler reign. Even the Lannisters, long known for their pride and ambition, found new purposes. Tyrion became a counselor not just to one house, but to all who sought his wisdom. Jaime devoted himself to training the next generation of knights in honor as well as skill. And Cersei, perhaps most surprisingly of all, found peace in simply watching her children grow up safe and happy. Years passed and the long night became the stuff of songs and stories told around warm fire. Children would listen with wide eyes as their grandparents spoke of the time when winter almost won, but was defeated by the simple but powerful act of choosing to stand together. Samwell Tarly, now an old man with more books than anyone could count, wrote the histories of those days. He was careful to record not just the battles and the great deeds, but the small moments of kindness that had kept hope alive in the darkest hours. The shared meal, the comforting word, the hand extended to help a fallen friend. It was never really about the magic, he would write in his careful script. The dragons and the ancient weapons were important, yes, but what defeated the darkness was much simpler and much more difficult. The choice to care for each other more than we cared for ourselves. Arya, though she traveled far and wide in the years that followed, would always return to Winterfell for the winter celebration. There she would tell stories of the lands beyond the maps, reminding everyone that the world was vast and full of wonders, but that home was the place where people knew your name and were glad to see you return. Bran, his strange gifts slowly fading as the need for them passed, became a keeper of stories himself. He would sit with the children of Winterfell and tell them tales not of war and death, but of the forest creatures who had helped in their own small ways, of the ravens who had carried hope on their wings, of the way the very trees seemed to bend their branches in blessing when good defeated evil. And so the realm entered a time that the Maesters would later call the Eternal Spring, not because the seasons ceased their ancient dance, but because the spirit of growth and renewal never left the hearts of those who remembered what they had almost lost. In Winterfell, the godswood grew thick and green, and the heart tree's red leaves whispered in the wind like gentle laughter. Children played beneath its branches, never knowing how close they had come to a world where no children would ever play again. The great houses continued their alliances, not from fear of a common enemy, but from the understanding that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Trade flourished, arts blossomed, and the realm grew rich not just in gold, but in the things that truly mattered: friendship, trust, and hope. On quiet evenings when the work of the day was done, people would gather to share stories and songs. They would speak of the heroes who had saved them, but more often, they would speak of each other, of neighbors who had shared their bread, of strangers who had become friends, of the small acts of courage that had proven, in the end, to be the greatest magic of all. And sometimes on the clearest nights, when the stars shone bright and the world was peaceful, they could see dragons flying high above, their wings catching the moonlight, not as harbingers of war, but as guardians of dreams, reminding all who saw them that even in the darkest winter, spring would always return to those who kept hope alive in their hearts. In the ancient days of Westeros, when the world was younger and magic flowed like rivers through the land, there lived creatures of such beauty and power that men called them dragons. Their scales caught sunlight like jewels, their wings could carry them beyond the highest mountains, and their breath was fire itself, not the destructive flame of war, but the warming fire of the hearth, the forge, and the beacon that guides travelers home. But as centuries passed, these magnificent beings faded from the world like stars at dawn, until they became nothing more than stories told to sleepy children. The last dragon egg grew cold, the last dragon song fell silent, and the world grew a little dimmer without their light. Yet in the deepest vaults of ancient castles, in the secret chambers of forgotten towers, 3 dragon eggs waited, not dead, not lost, but sleeping, waiting for the right moment, the right heart, the right dreams to call them back to life. Across the narrow sea, in lands of sun and spice, lived a young woman named Daenerys. She had hair like moonbeams and eyes the color of summer skies. But more importantly, she carried within her heart something that had grown rare in the world: the ability to dream of better tomorrows. She had been given 3 dragon eggs as a wedding gift, stones that others saw as beautiful ornaments, cold and lifeless as jewels. But when Daenerys held them, she felt warmth, as if somewhere deep inside the stone shells, tiny hearts were beating in rhythm with her own. They say dragons are gone forever, her advisor Jorah told her one evening as she sat by her fire, the eggs resting in her lap like sleeping cats. He was a good man who had learned that protecting others was more important than protecting himself. But what if forever isn't as long as we think? Daenerys replied, her fingers tracing the patterns on the shells. What if they're just waiting for someone who believes in magic strongly enough to call them home? That night, she dreamed of flying through clouds that tasted of cinnamon and starlight, of looking down on the world from heights where the air was thin and clear. And in her dreams she was not alone. 3 voices sang with hers, ancient and young at the same time, full of joy at being remembered. When morning came, the eggs were warm to the touch, and tiny cracks appeared along their surfaces, like the first smile lines on a happy face. The birth of dragons is not a violent thing, though many stories make it seem so. When Daenerys's dragons finally broke free from their shells, it was gentle as the breaking of dawn, a slow emergence from darkness into light, from sleep into wakefulness, from dream into reality. The first to hatch was black with red eyes that gleamed like garnets. She named him Drogon, after a king from old stories who had been fierce but just. The second was cream and gold, beautiful as sunlight on wheat fields, and she called him Viserion. The third was green and bronze, with scales that shifted color like leaves in autumn wind, and his name was Rhaegal. They were no larger than house cats at first, but even as babies they possessed a dignity that made everyone who saw them stop and stare in wonder. They would perch on Daenerys's shoulders as she went about her day, their tiny heads turning to observe everything with the ancient wisdom that all dragons carry. "They're magnificent," whispered Tyrion Lannister when he first met them months later. The clever little lord had traveled far from his home in Westeros, drawn by rumors of dragons' return to the world. "But I sense they understand more than they let on." Indeed, the dragons seemed to listen when Daenerys spoke of her dreams for the world. a place where the strong protected the weak, where children could play without fear, where the season of endless winter that threatened the north might finally end. They would croon softly when she spoke of home, of the green lands across the sea where her ancestors had once ruled with wisdom rather than fear. But while dragons were being reborn in the warm lands of Essos, a different kind of awakening was stirring in the frozen north of Westeros. Beyond the great wall of ice, where the wind howled like lonesome wolves and the snow never melted, ancient eyes opened for the first time in thousands of years. The Night King stood at the heart of the winter wasteland, his form tall and terrible, carved from ice and shadow. He was not evil in the way that men were evil, driven by greed or rage or fear. But rather he was the opposite of life itself. The silence that followed the last song, the cold that came after the last fire died. Around him his army stirred to wakefulness. These were not soldiers in any sense that the living would understand, but rather the end of all soldiers, the final answer to every battle ever fought. They moved with perfect unity because they shared a single purpose: to bring the quiet peace of winter to a world that seemed determined to stay loud and warm and alive. Jon Snow, the brave young man who guarded the wall with his black-cloaked brothers, felt the change before he saw it. The wind carried a different kind of cold now, one that seemed to seep into bones and hearts alike. "Something's coming," he told his friend Sam as they stood watch on the wall's icy battlements. Sam was round and gentle, more comfortable with books than swords, but his eyes were sharp when it came to reading the signs that others missed. "The old stories speak of times like this," Sam said, pulling his cloak tighter against the biting wind, "when winter itself would march south, led by a king made of ice and silence. But they also speak of fire that could hold it back." "Fire?" Jon asked, though something in his heart already knew the answer. "Dragons," Sam whispered, and the word hung in the air between them like a prayer. News traveled on raven wings and merchant ships, in the songs of traveling singers and the whispered conversations of lords in their great halls. Dragons had returned to the world, and their mother was sailing west across the narrow sea, her eyes fixed on the Iron Throne that had once belonged to her family. But fate, it seemed, had larger plans than the simple conquest of kingdoms. When Daenerys's ship first came in sight of Dragonstone, the ancient island fortress where her ancestors had once ruled, her dragons circled overhead like living banners. They had grown large now. Drogon's wingspan could shadow a courtyard, and his roar could be heard for miles, not terrifying, but magnificent, like thunder rolling across summer hills. It was there on the black stone terraces of Dragonstone that she first met the lords and ladies of Westeros who would become her allies. Tyrion came first, his clever tongue and wise counsel proving that size mattered less than heart. Then came others. Jon Snow from the Wall, bringing tales of the growing darkness in the north. Sansa Stark from Winterfell, her red hair bright as flame, carrying the strength that comes from surviving the worst and still choosing to hope for better. "We need each other," Jon said simply, as they stood watching the dragons play in the surf, diving for fish and sending up great sprays of water that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. "The enemy we face cannot be defeated by any one person, any one army, any one dream, but together." "Together," Daenerys agreed, and as she spoke her dragons sang, a sound like wind chimes made of starlight, like the first bird call of morning, like laughter that had learned to fly. In the months that followed, as winter deepened and the Night King's army pressed closer to the wall, alliances formed that had once seemed impossible. The proud lords of Westeros, who had spent years fighting each other for scraps of power, began to understand that there would be no power left to fight over if the cold took everything. Ravens flew constantly between the great castles, carrying not threats or demands but requests for help, offers of support, shared plans for survival. In King's Landing, Queen Cersei wrestled with her pride, knowing that her lions would need to fight beside wolves and dragons if any of them were to see another spring. At Winterfell, the ancient seat of House Stark, preparations went on day and night. Arya Stark, the wolf girl who had learned the arts of silence and shadow, worked with the castle's smiths to forge weapons from dragon glass. the volcanic stone that could cut through the magic that bound the dead. "It's strange," she said to her sister Sansa as they watched servants carrying bundles of the black glass weapons to the armory. "We spent so long learning to fight each other. Now we have to learn to fight as one." Sansa nodded, her hands busy with the endless task of organizing supplies, planning defenses, writing letters to call in every favor and alliance their family had ever made. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "that's what we were really learning all along. Not how to fight, but how to protect what mattered." Bran Stark, whose strange gifts allowed him to see across vast distances and through the veils of time, sat quietly in the Godswood, his eyes reflecting depths that seemed older than the ancient heart tree itself. Sometimes he would speak in his soft voice, sharing visions of where the enemy moved, what they planned, how they might be stopped. "They fear the fire," he would say, his words carrying the weight of centuries. "Not the fire that burns and destroys, but the fire that warms and protects, the fire that lives in hearts that beat for others." When Daenerys finally flew north on Drogon's back, with Viserion and Rhaegal flanking them like an honor guard of living flame, it was not as a conqueror but as a guardian coming home. Below them, the landscape stretched white and pristine, beautiful in the way that sleeping things are beautiful, but too quiet, too still. The dragons felt it too, the wrongness in the air, the way the very wind seemed to hold its breath. They flew faster, their wings beating with urgency, carrying their mother toward the place where fire and ice would meet in the battle that would decide the fate of all living things. At Winterfell, the sight of dragons in the sky brought tears to many eyes, not tears of fear, but of hope. Hope that they would not have to face the darkness alone. Hope that magic could still serve life rather than death. Hope that even the longest winter must eventually give way to spring. Jon Snow stood in the courtyard as Daenerys landed, Drogon's great form folding his wings with the grace of a creature born to the sky. When she slid down from his back, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight from the castle's many torches, she looked not like a conqueror or a queen, but like a sister, a friend, an ally who had traveled far to stand with them against the dark. "My lady," Jon said, offering a small bow that spoke of respect rather than submission. "My lord," she replied, and then with a smile that transformed her face from beautiful to radiant, "My friend, we have much to do, and not much time to do it." In the great hall of Winterfell, where Stark banners had hung for 1,000 years, the final war council convened. Lords and ladies from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms sat at the same table, their differences set aside in the face of a threat that cared nothing for borders or birthright. Daenerys sat beside Jon, with Tyrion on her other side, his clever mind already working through strategies and possibilities. Sansa presided with the grace of someone who had learned that true strength lay not in commanding others but in helping them find their own strength. Even Jaime Lannister was there, his golden hand resting on the table, his face serious as he spoke of the lessons he had learned about honor and sacrifice. "The dead are 3 days from the wall," reported a scout, his voice steady despite the fear in his eye. "They move in silence, but their numbers, there are more than we can count." "Numbers have never been everything," said Arya quietly, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "We have something they don't." "And what's that?" asked Jaime. "Each other," Jon answered, and around the table heads nodded in agreement. The plan they made was simple in its complexity. They would meet the army of the dead at Winterfell, in the place where the living had gathered their strength. The dragons would provide fire from above, while the armies of men held the ground. Most importantly, they would fight not as separate forces but as one people, each protecting the others, each willing to sacrifice for the whole. When the battle came, it came like a slow avalanche, inevitable, overwhelming, but not without beauty in its terrible way. The night sky was clear, stars shining down like distant candles, and the moon cast silver light on the snow-covered battleground. The dragons were magnificent in their element, their fire cutting through the darkness like liquid light. Drogon roared challenges that echoed off the castle walls, while Viserion and Rhaegal danced through the air with deadly grace. Where their flames touched, the magic that bound the dead crumbled and the false soldiers fell like marionettes with cut strings. On the ground, the battle was fierce but not hopeless. Jon fought with the sword he had carried since his days as a bastard of Winterfell, each stroke precise and determined. Beside him, warriors from every great house stood shoulder to shoulder, Northmen and Southerners, knights and sellswords, all united by the simple desire to see the sun rise again. Arya moved through the battle like a deadly shadow, her blade finding the spaces between armor and certainty. She had learned long ago that size mattered less than speed, that fear was a weapon that could be turned against those who wielded it. But it was perhaps Bran who fought the most crucial battle of all, though he never lifted a sword. Sitting in the Godswood, his consciousness ranging far beyond his body, he reached out with his strange gifts to touch the mind of the Night King himself, not to control or destroy, but to understand. What he found there was not evil, but emptiness, a void where warmth and Lathid and hope should have been. The Night King was not a tyrant seeking power, but rather a force of nature, like winter itself, doing what he had been made to do. He doesn't want to rule, Bran called out, his voice somehow carrying across the battlefield despite his quiet tone. He wants to end the story, but stories don't end. They just begin again. The turning point came not with a great explosion or dramatic duel, but with something much simpler and more powerful. As the battle raged through the night, the people of Winterfell, soldiers and servants, lords and common folk, began to sing. It started with one voice, a young girl who worked in the kitchens, humming a lullaby her mother had taught her. Others joined in, one by one, until the song rose above the sound of battle, above the roar of dragons, above the clash of weapons against death itself. The song spoke of home and hearth, of love that endured beyond life, of hope that burned brighter than any flame. And as it rose, something changed in the air. The darkness seemed less absolute, the cold less bitter, the fear less overwhelming. The Night King paused in his advance, his icy features showing something that might have been confusion, or perhaps recognition. For the first time in millennia, he remembered what it felt like to be something other than the end of all things. That moment of hesitation was all Jon needed. With a cry that carried the voices of all his ancestors, all the Starks who had ever stood guard against the dark, he struck with everything he had. Not just his sword, but his love for his family, his duty to the realm, his hope for tomorrow. The Night King fell, and with him, the spell that bound his army crumbled. The dead lay down to their final rest, and the long winter began to retreat northward, back to the lands beyond the wall, where it belonged. As dawn broke over Winterfell, painting the snow-covered battlements in shades of rose and gold, the survivors gathered in the courtyard. There were fewer of them than had stood there the night before, and empty spaces marked where friends had fallen. But they had won something more precious than victory. They had won tomorrow. Daenerys stood with her dragons, their great forms no longer weapons of war, but guardians of peace. The fire that danced around their jaws was warm and welcoming, the fire of celebration, of cooking meals for hungry friends, of lighting the way home for travelers in the dark. "What happens now?" asked Sansa, her voice carrying the exhaustion that comes after great effort, but also the satisfaction of duty well done. "Now we rebuild," Jon answered, looking out over the realm they had saved together. "We make this a place worth saving." In the days that followed, as spring began its slow return to the north, the great work of restoration began. Lords and ladies who had learned to fight together now learned to build together. Trade routes reopened, carrying not just goods but stories, songs and the news that winter had passed, and the world was safe again. The dragons became symbols of the new age, not of conquest, but of protection. Children would watch them flying overhead and feel safe, knowing that such magnificent creatures watched over their sleep. Poets wrote songs about them, not as destroyers but as guardians of dreams. Years passed, and the Battle of Winterfell became legend, then myth, then the stuff of bedtime stories told to sleepy children. but the changes it brought were real and lasting. The Iron Throne was melted down and forged into a round table where representatives from all the kingdoms could sit as equals. The wall remained, but as a monument to unity rather than division. Daenerys found that ruling through love was far more satisfying than ruling through fear. Her dragons grew old gracefully, spending their days teaching young dragonlings. For dragons had returned to the world to stay, no longer rare and precious but common as sunrise, beautiful as rain. Jon eventually returned to the north, not as a bastard or a lord, but as a guardian, one of many who kept watch to ensure that darkness would never again catch the realm unprepared. He found peace in the simple work of protection, in knowing that others could sleep safely, because he was willing to stay awake. Sansa became the queen in the north, but her crown was made of flowers rather than gold, and her throne was a simple chair where anyone could come to speak their troubles. Her rule was gentle but firm, built on the understanding that strength came from helping others find their own strength. Arya traveled the world, carrying tales of the great battle to distant lands, but always returning home for the winter celebration. She would sit by the fire in Winterfell's great hall and tell stories of the places she had seen, the people she had met, the adventures that awaited those brave enough to seek them. Even Tyrion found his place in the new world. His cleverness turned to the work of building rather than scheming. He wrote books, histories of the great battle, but also comedies and romances, stories that made people laugh and cry and remember what it felt like to be fully alive. Bran grew into his strange gifts, becoming not a ruler but a keeper of memory, helping people remember the important things while letting the painful ones fade into the gentle twilight of the past. Under his guidance, the realm learned to honor its history without being trapped by it. And so the realm entered an age that the historians would call the Eternal Spring. Not because the seasons ceased their ancient dance, but because the spirit of growth and renewal had taken root in the hearts of all who lived there. The dragons, now numbering in the dozens, made their homes in the high towers of ancient castles, their presence a constant reminder that magic still existed in the world. They would sing in the evenings, their voices joining the wind to create music that carried for miles, lullabies that helped the whole realm sleep peacefully. In the villages and towns, in the great cities and the small farms, people went about their lives with the quiet contentment that comes from knowing they are safe. Children played in streets and gardens, their laughter carrying on the wind like scattered flower petals. Old people sat in the sun and told stories, their voices carrying the wisdom of those who had lived through the darkness and emerged into light. The seasons turned as they always had, but each winter was gentler than the last, and each spring brought new reasons for hope. Apple trees bloomed in orchards that had once been battlefields. Rivers ran clear and cold, carrying fish that flashed silver in the sunlight. Forest grew thick and green, home to creatures both magical and mundane, all living in harmony under the protective watch of dragons in the sky. On quiet evenings when the day's work was done and families gathered around their fires, they would sometimes speak of the great battle, of the heroes who had saved them all. But more often, they would speak of smaller things, of neighbors who had shared their bread, of strangers who had become friends, of the simple daily miracles that made life worth living. And sometimes on the clearest nights, when the stars shone bright and the world was at peace, they could see dragons silhouetted against the moon, their wings spread wide as they soared through the darkness, not as harbingers of war or destruction, but as guardians of dreams, watching over a realm that had learned at last that the greatest magic of all was the choice to stand together against whatever darkness might come. The fires burned bright in every hearth, the songs were sweet in every hall, and the dreams were gentle in every bed. The dawn of the dragon had become the dawn of hope itself, and all was well in the realm where ice and fire had learned to dance together instead of fight. And so they all lived, not happily ever after, but safely ever after, which is perhaps the greatest gift any of us can give to those we love. In the aftermath of the great battle, when the last echo of clashing swords had faded, and the Night King's darkness had finally been lifted from the world. Westeros lay like a garden after a storm, broken in places, scarred by the violence of wind and hail, but alive, breathing, ready to grow again. The morning sun rose over Winterfell with unusual gentleness, as if it too understood that the world needed time to heal. Its light fell on battlements that bore the marks of dragonfire and ancient ice, on courtyards where heroes had made their final stands, on the godswood where the heart tree's red leaves seemed to whisper prayers of gratitude to the wind. In the great hall where only days before, lords and ladies had planned for what might be the end of all things, a different kind of council now gathered. These were not the urgent voices of war, but the quieter, more thoughtful tones of those who must rebuild what has been broken. Sansa Stark stood at the high table, her auburn hair catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. She looked older than her years, as all of them did now, aged not by time but by the weight of choices made and prices paid. Yet there was something peaceful in her bearing, the calm that comes to those who have faced their worst fears and found they could endure. "The North remembers," she said softly, speaking the ancient words of her house. "But now we must decide what we choose to remember, and what we choose to let rest." Around her, the faces of those who had survived the long night bore the mixed expressions of relief and sorrow that follow great trial. Jon Snow sat quietly, his hands folded, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He had carried the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that the fate of the living rested in his choices, and though victory had been won, the weight of it would never fully leave his shoulder. "There is much to repair," said Tyrion Lannister, his voice carrying the careful precision of one who had learned to measure each word. "Castles to rebuild, families to reunite, trust to restore. The Night King may be gone, but the work of healing has only just begun." Daenerys sat near the fire, her silver hair braided simply, her hands resting on her lap. Her dragons were visible through the great windows, their forms graceful against the morning sky, no longer instruments of war, but symbols of the peace they had all fought to preserve. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of one who had learned that true power lay not in conquering but in protecting. "We have been given a gift," she said, her violet eyes reflecting the flames. Time to make things right. Time to heal the wounds we've inflicted on each other. Time to build something better than what came before." In the days that followed, as the great armies dispersed and the lords and ladies returned to their lands, the slower, quieter work of restoration began. It was not the dramatic labor of battle, but the patient craft of mending. Broken walls rebuilt stone by stone, burned fields replanted seed by seed, torn relationships rewoven thread by careful thread. At Winterfell, Arya walked through the castle's corridors, her soft footsteps echoing in spaces that had once rung with the sounds of preparation for war. She paused at windows to look out over the courtyard, where already the signs of normal life were returning. Servants went about their daily tasks, children played in the spaces between the cobblestones, and the sound of laughter, rare and precious during the dark months, began to fill the air once more. "It's strange," she said to Bran, who sat in his wheeled chair beneath the heart tree, his eyes distant but peaceful. "I spent so long learning to fight, to be ready for the worst. Now I have to remember how to simply live." Bran smiled, an expression that transformed his solemn face into something younger, more hopeful. "Perhaps that's the most important skill of all," he said. "To live well, to find joy in small things, to be present for the people who matter to us. The great battles are won by heroes, but the great peace is built by everyone, one day at a time." The ravens that had once carried urgent messages of war now flew with gentler cargo, letters from friends, invitations to feasts, news of births and marriages, and all the small celebrations that mark a world returning to light. The maesters in their towers found themselves writing not of troop movements and siege preparations, but of harvest and trade routes, of the practical, hopeful work of a realm, learning to trust in tomorrow. Far to the south, In the golden halls of Casterly Rock, the Lannister family faced their own quiet reckoning. The great lion banners still hung from the walls, but they seemed different now. Less fierce, more noble. Symbols of strength used to protect rather than to intimidate. Cersei stood on the balcony of her father's old chambers, looking out over the lands that had been her family's for centuries. The weight of the crown she had once worn so proudly was gone. But in its place was something she had not expected to find: peace. The desperate hunger for power that had driven her for so long had been replaced by something simpler and more satisfying: the desire to see her children grow up safe and happy. "I spent so many years afraid," she said to Jaime, who stood beside her, his golden hand resting on the stone railing. "Afraid of losing what we had. Afraid of our enemies, afraid of the future. But fear makes us do terrible things to the people we love most." Jaime nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had made his own share of mistakes, choices driven by desperation and pride that had cost dearly. But the war against the dead had taught him something valuable: that redemption was possible, that it was never too late to choose differently, to be better than the person you had been. "Father always said a Lannister pays his debts," Jaime said quietly. "Perhaps it's time we started paying the good debts, the ones we owe to people who trusted us, who forgave us, who gave us chances we didn't deserve." Together they began the work of rebuilding not just their house but their honor. They opened the grain stores during the lean months, sent gold to help repair the damage of war, welcomed back bannermen who had fought against them with forgiveness rather than vengeance. Slowly, carefully, they began to weave new stories about what it meant to be a Lannister. Stories of generosity rather than greed, of protection rather than predation. Tyrion, when he visited from his duties in King's Landing, watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. "You know," he said to his siblings one evening, as they sat by the fire in the Great Hall, "I always thought our family words should be a Lannister pays his debts. But perhaps now they could be a Lannister keeps his promises." Above all the healing lands of Westeros, the dragons soared on wings that caught the sunlight like stained glass windows. They were no longer the terrible instruments of war they had once been, but something far more beautiful. Living symbols of the magic that still existed in the world. Proof that wonder and beauty could survive even the darkest time. Drogon, the largest and most magnificent, had taken to nesting in the towers of Dragonstone, his great form visible for miles as he perched on the ancient battlements. His roar, once a sound of terror, had become something else entirely: a call of greeting to ships returning to harbor, a song of celebration that rolled across the water like distant thunder. Viserion and Rhaegal had found their own places in the world. Viserion had claimed the highest tower of the Red Keep in King's Landing, where his golden scales caught the morning light and scattered it across the city like scattered coin. Children would gather in the streets below to watch him fly, their faces turned upward in wonder, their voices joining in songs that seemed to call the dragons closer. Rhaegal had chosen to make his home in the north, among the mountains and forests where the old magic still ran strong. Hunters and travelers would sometimes catch glimpses of him through the trees, his green and bronze scales blending with the forest shadows, his presence a reminder that the world was larger and more mysterious than most people ever imagined. But perhaps most importantly, the dragons had begun to sing again. Not the harsh cries of battle, but the ancient songs their kind had known before men learned to fear them. In the evenings when the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their voices would rise in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with magic. People would stop their work to listen, their faces turned toward the sky, their hearts lifted by music that spoke of things beyond the everyday world, of courage and love, of sacrifice and hope, of the endless dance between light and darkness that gave meaning to both. As the seasons turned and the immediate wounds of war began to heal, the people of Westeros discovered something remarkable: that peace, while less dramatic than war, was far more beautiful. In the absence of constant fear, Small joys bloomed like flowers after rain. In the markets of King's Landing, merchants who had once sold weapons and armor now offered silk and spices, books and musical instruments, all the gentle luxuries that make life pleasant rather than merely endurable. The sound of hammers on anvils was no longer the desperate forging of swords, but the cheerful creation of horseshoes and kitchen knives, plowshares and garden tools. The Great Sept, partially destroyed during the Troubles, was rebuilt not as a monument to power but as a place of genuine sanctuary. People came there not to seek favor from the gods, but to find quiet moments of reflection, to light candles for those they had lost, to whisper prayers of gratitude for those they still held dear. In the smaller towns and villages scattered across the Seven Kingdoms, life took on a rhythm that had been lost during the years of war. Harvest festivals returned, their tables groaning under the weight of food shared freely among neighbors. Wedding celebrations lasted for days, with music and dancing that spoke of joy in the present and hope for the future. Children played games that their grandparents remembered, ancient songs and dances that connected them to the long chain of peaceful generations. Even the roads, once dangerous places where travelers went in fear of bandits and armies, became safe again. Inns reopened their doors to wanderers and merchants, their common rooms filled with the comfortable chatter of people who had stories to share rather than secrets to hide. Minstrels traveled from town to town carrying news and songs, weaving the scattered communities of the realm into a single vibrant tapestry. At Winterfell, the heart of the North, the Stark family found themselves becoming what they had always been meant to be. Not rulers through conquest or fear, but guardians of something precious and irreplaceable. The castle's ancient stones, scarred by battle but still standing strong, seemed to exhale a long-held breath, settling into their foundations with the contentment of a task well done. Sansa's rule was unlike any the North had ever known. She held no grand ceremonies or elaborate courts, but instead spent her days walking among her people, listening to their concerns, helping to solve the small problems that accumulated, made the difference between misery and contentment. Her presence was like a warm hearth in winter, not flashy or dramatic, but essential, comforting, the kind of strength that endured. The North has always been different, she would tell visiting lords from the South, as they sat in Winterfell's great hall, its walls decorated now with tapestries depicting not battles but scenes of daily life, harvests and festivals, children at play. The quiet moments that made up the true wealth of the realm. We don't rule here so much as we tend, like gardeners, like shepherds. We help things grow. Jon, though he had refused all titles and crowns, found his own way to serve. He traveled throughout the North, visiting isolated communities, helping to solve disputes, carrying news and supplies to places that might otherwise be forgotten. His presence was a bridge between the great houses and the common folk, a reminder that nobility came not from birth but from service. I always wondered what my purpose was, he told Sansa one evening, as they stood on Winterfell's walls, watching the aurora dance across the northern sky. Bastard, Lord, King, none of those titles ever felt right, but this, helping people, protecting them, making sure they're not forgotten, this feels like home. Arya had found her own calling in the work of remembering. She traveled throughout the Seven Kingdoms, collecting the stories of ordinary people who had survived the war, farmers who had hidden refugees, innkeepers who had shared their food with strangers, children who had shown courage beyond their years. These stories she brought back to Winterfell, where they were written down and preserved, ensuring that the real heroes of the war would not be forgotten. History remembers kings and queens, she said, her fingers stained with ink from her writing. But it's the everyday heroes who actually make the world worth saving. The mother who shares her last loaf of bread, the smith who works through the night to repair a stranger's cart, the child who offers comfort to someone who's afraid. These are the people who kept the light burning when everything seemed dark. In the Citadel, that great center of learning in Old Town, the Maesters faced their own transformation. For centuries they had studied the ways of war and power, the movements of armies and the strategies of conquest. Now they turned their attention to gentler arts, the healing of bodies and hearts, the preservation of stories and songs, the patient work of understanding the natural world. Grand Maester Samuel, who had once been a frightened boy afraid of his own shadow, now led the order with quiet authority. Under his guidance, the Maesters began to collect not just the chronicles of great events, but the small stories that made up the real life of the realm, recipes passed down through generations, lullabies sung to sleepy children, the folk wisdom that helped ordinary people navigate the challenges of everyday life. Knowledge is not just about understanding how things work, he would tell the young men who came to study in the Citadel's halls. It's about understanding why things matter. A song that comforts a grieving heart is as valuable as a treatise on siege warfare. A remedy that eases a child's fever is as important as a map of distant lands. We serve the realm not by knowing everything, but by caring about everyone. The great library of the Citadel grew in new directions, its shelves filling with books that previous generations might have dismissed as unworthy of preservation. Collections of children's stories, guides to medicinal herbs, detailed records of local customs and traditions, all found their place alongside the ancient histories and scholarly treatises. Ravens still flew from the Citadel to every corner of the realm, but their message had changed. Instead of warnings and urgent summons, they now carried requests for information about local festivals, invitations to share knowledge about healing herbs, gentle reminders that even the smallest community was part of the larger tapestry of the realm. In King's Landing, Daenerys had found that ruling a peaceful kingdom was far more challenging than conquering a hostile one. The Iron Throne had been melted down and replaced with a simple chair of polished wood, surrounded by a round table where representatives from all the kingdoms could sit as equals. The throne room itself had been transformed from a place of judgment and fear into a hall of discussion and cooperation. Power, she had learned, is not about making people do what you want. It's about helping them do what they need to do to be happy and safe. Her dragons had become the most beloved residents of the capital. They would perch on the towers of the Red Keep, their presence a constant reminder that magic existed in the world, that wonder was still possible. Children would gather in the courtyards below, hoping to catch a glimpse of the magnificent creatures, their faces bright with the kind of joy that comes from seeing something beautiful and knowing it belongs to everyone. The city itself had been transformed. The slums and poorhouses had been replaced with clean, comfortable housing. The sewers had been rebuilt, the streets paved with smooth stones that didn't turn to mud in the rain. Gardens had been planted in every available space, filling the air with the scent of flowers and the sound of bees. But perhaps most importantly, the people of King's Landing had learned to trust again. They walked the streets without fear, gathered in the squares to share news and stories, opened their doors to neighbors and strangers alike. The city had become what it was always meant to be, not a place of power and intrigue, but a home for people who had chosen to live together in peace. As the years passed and the realm settled into its new rhythms, a new kind of culture began to emerge. The bards and minstrels who had once sung of battles and conquests now crafted songs about different kinds of heroism, the quiet courage of those who chose kindness over cruelty, the strength of those who forgave rather than sought revenge, the wisdom of those who built rather than destroyed. In the great halls and humble taverns, in the marketplaces and along the roads, these songs spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in hearts that had learned to hope again. Children grew up hearing stories that taught them that the greatest adventures were often the ones that ended not with victory over enemies, but with the discovery of friends. The festivals that marked the changing seasons became occasions for the entire realm to celebrate together. Ravens would carry invitations from town to town, and people would travel great distances to join in the celebration. These gatherings became opportunities not just for entertainment, but for the sharing of knowledge, the arrangement of marriages, the strengthening of bonds that held the realm together. Artists and craftsmen no longer needed to create weapons and fortifications. turned their skills to beautifying the world. Sculptures appeared in public squares, depicting not conquering heroes, but ordinary people engaged in the work of daily life. A mother nursing her child, a farmer tending his crops, children playing in a garden. These works reminded everyone who saw them that the real wealth of the realm lay not in gold or power, but in the simple fact of being alive and able to love. The dragons themselves became the living symbols of the new age. They were no longer rare and precious, creatures of legend and fear, but part of the fabric of everyday life. Young dragons, hatched from eggs that Daenerys' three had laid in the years of peace, made their homes throughout the realm, each one a guardian of the community it chose to protect. These younger dragons were different from their war-tested parents. They had never known battle, never breathed fire in anger, never felt the weight of carrying riders into mortal combat. Instead, they had learned to be helpers and companions, using their strength to aid in construction projects, their keen eyes to watch for travelers in distress, their fierce loyalty to protect those who needed protection. Children who grew up with dragons learned lessons that no previous generation had ever had the chance to learn. That power without compassion was meaningless, that strength was best used in service of others, that the most magnificent creatures in the world could also be the gentle. The dragon songs that echoed across the realm each evening became a kind of benediction, a musical reminder that the day was ending peacefully, that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for joy and service, that the long nightmare of war and fear was truly over. And so, as the sun set on another peaceful day in Westeros, as the dragons sang their evening songs and the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, the realm settled into the quiet contentment of a world at peace. In Winterfell, Sansa sat by her fire, reading letters from friends and allies, planning improvements to the lives of her people, preparing for the gentle challenges of tomorrow. The castle around her was full of the comfortable sounds of a household at rest, servants finishing their tasks, guards changing shifts, children being told bedtime stories. In King's Landing, Daenerys stood on her balcony, watching her dragons settle into their evening roosts, their forms silhouetted against the stars. The city below was quiet but not empty, filled with the peaceful sounds of families gathering for their evening meals, of friends sharing stories, of a community that had learned to trust in tomorrow. Throughout the realm, in great castles and small cottages, in bustling towns and quiet villages, people went about the gentle rituals of ending the day. Fires were banked, doors were locked, children were tucked into their beds with kisses and whispered promises that they were safe, that they were loved, that the morning would bring new reasons to be grateful. The wars were over, the realm was whole. The dragons soared through peaceful skies, their songs a lullaby for a world that had earned its rest. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the realm slept peacefully under the protection of dragons, and the watchful care of those who had learned that true power lay in service, the very stones of Westeros seemed to breathe a long sigh of satisfaction. The final rest had come at last. Not the rest of death, but the rest of peace, the gentle sleep of those who know they are safe, loved and part of something larger and more beautiful than themselves. And as you close your eyes tonight, may you find the same peaceful rest that came to the realm of Westeros, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for kindness, for joy, for the simple magic of being alive in a world where dragons sing lullabies and heroes are those who choose to care for others. Sleep well and dream of dragons.